Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk. I'm Becky Bracken, editor with Dark Reading. Next up, I am pleased to welcome Joe FitzPatrick. He is a trainer and researcher at Securing Hardware. He's presenting this year several trainings on hardware attacks. He culminated it with a final one on hardware implants. So we're here to hear all about those. Thank you for being with us, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
So walk us through what you've been working on here. I know you've been terribly busy on all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, I've been training at Black Hat for many years now and kind of have built up a series of classes. First, to basically kind of fill the gaps between people who have hardware backgrounds and people who have security backgrounds, because there aren't a lot of overlap there. And kind of built on that, so first a class on just the basics of hardware hacking, some JTAG, UART, and SPY interfaces. And then follow on to that, we talked about hardware pen testing, putting hardware hacking into like a standard workflow. And then, we wanted to go even further than that. In those classes, we have prepared targets, hardware that is all ready to be hacked on. And so rapid prototyping is how we're going to go and build tiny little devices that let us go and connect to the right headers and pins on our systems. And that all culminates in a class called hardware implants, which is where we take the techniques of attacking from the first one and the organization and planning of the second one and the manufacturing of the third one and do things like manipulate a USB cable so we can implant a little circuit board inside of an existing USB cable.
Now, you say there's not a lot of overlap between hardware and security. Where are most companies? Is this just something they're not looking at all? Is it something they're not paying enough attention to? Where are we?
I think there is a lot of overlap. The problem is there's not a lot of skills in the overlapping area. There are a lot of companies who, kind of more IoT type companies that focus a lot on the software. They'll get off-the-shelf hardware from an OEM. They'll brand it with their label, logo, sticker, whatever, and make their web app that sits on top of that software. They never look at the software. They never look at the firmware. And they definitely never look at hardware. And so that's what I think needs to happen. I think that people need to be aware of the hardware that they have, that they're using, that they're selling, and that they're buying.
So talk a little bit about this training. I think this is so interesting. So you've put this little chip into this USB, and then what happens when I plug this in, an unsuspecting user uses it?
Well, this specific one was actually designed by a friend of mine, Mike Rover, and he has this thing where basically it works as a programmable USB device, a keyboard, plays back keyboard commands, opens up web pages, stuff like that. This is just one of actually 5 examples of things we do in the class. It's just the easiest to see because, it's a USB cable, and everybody's seen one of those before, right?
Yeah.
And everybody has trusted one of them before to do a job like charging.
From strangers.
Yeah.
Can I use that?
Well, people talk about like the, don't use unknown charging devices because you don't want to stick,
Or the ports at the airport.
Yeah. Well, I mean, instead of putting that thing in the wall plug, you put it in the cable, or So, yeah. There's a lot of stuff to worry about these days. Especially, I think miniaturization has been a lot of what causes that. We can fit in 1 square inch an entire full stack Linux operating system with a cellular modem at this point. So it's kind of crazy.
That is really, really crazy. So what were the core lessons that you wanted your trainees to take away?
That's interesting. So some people take the class because they want to know how to build cool things, which is great. But I think the other takeaway is that when people talk about exotic hardware attacks, they think of hard work and big funding and a lot of time. And it's a 2-day class, right? In 2 days, we find a system, we rip it apart, we look at it, we prototype an attack, we build a piece of hardware, and we have it standalone drop that attack. So what it points out is that these aren't exotic, these aren't amazing. You don't need to be a nation state, a government, or organized crime to do this. Joe in your garage in the backyard can build some of these things in a couple of days.
Now, one of the issues that I've learned about in my reporting is when you talk about the IoT space, in the OT space, because so many of these devices are old and rigid and, they're not meant to be. How do you foresee the correct way for us to sort of get a handle around the IoT device security issue?
I kind of, look at it from a broader perspective of all embedded devices, not just IoT, OT stuff. And what I see is that we have a lot of old assumptions that we've made about physical security, thinking we used to just lock the door to the office where we kept our desktop computers. That doesn't work with laptops. Well, the same with our embedded devices. We designed embedded devices at a time when they were rigid and we may have physical security of them. And now these IoT devices are going to exist in hotel rooms, in homes, at front doors, on locks. And so the physical security requirements have changed and basically gone away but we still have to have hardware that is going to be resistant to tampering, to cloning, to manipulation, and stuff like that.
So is it a matter of building hardware of the future that is more resilient and more set up for this sort of system?
Yeah, at this point in time, we have a lot of components that are designed with security from the beginning. So it's easy to find an inexpensive CPU that supports a secure boot process. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. You had to pay extra to get a fancy one that specifically supported security boot. So you can have literally an implant in a USB cable that has a secure boot process where you don't need to have something exotic anymore.
So do you feel like, and I've heard this trend sort of repeated in different ways over the course of my time here at Black Hat, that the wall between hardware and software and all of that is getting thinner and thinner, and that hardware security is more able to impact software security than ever. Does that track with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of realizations. It used to be that software, you think of a software stack, all of that runs on top of hardware, and people thought of the hardware as like a solid bedrock they were building on. We're realizing that it's not. Hardware is layers upon layers of implementation, all the way up to firmware. We have a whole world of software people who say, oh, it's firmware, that's part of the hardware. And there's a whole world of hardware people who say, oh, firmware, that's part of the software. And no one really worried about it for a while. Now we actually have people focused on that, and we have firmware development processes that are more akin to modern software development than they are of 1990s hardware development.
And on the flip side of that, have attackers already understood the possibilities in the firmware layer and in the hardware layer? I mean, are they taking advantage?
Absolutely. We've seen a few cases where there actually are malicious things put into firmware. And whether they are malicious things put in a supply chain or whether this is after the fact, and we have malware that goes and actually targets firmware, it's there. And attackers know that firmware is software and that it's configurable and programmable. And
so they're up to speed.
Yeah, they're up to speed. Well, some of them are up to speed. Those that need to be. The reality is, as long as there's software attacks that are easier, attackers will go to that. As long as there are hardware attacks that are easier, attackers will go to that. And if firmware attacks happen to be what's easiest, that's where they're going to go.
For enterprise teams who are not really in the weeds on this yet, what is a good place? I would just understand maybe your trainings are a good place, but really where is a place that people can go to fill that skills gap?
It's interesting because it's very hard to fill the skills gap. That's why I do training.
That's why you're here. Yeah.
But without focusing on that, basically understanding what hardware you have. A lot of places will have a server room. And you have servers in there, but have you ever opened them up? Have you ever looked at them? Do you know that there's the servers you bought and not the servers you bought plus something else?
So that's deeper than just trying to find all your devices.
Yeah. So at the first, you enumerate what you see from a network, from a software perspective. Do it from a physical perspective as well. And as you kind of do this, you need to have some expectations of your suppliers. When you're buying a server from a supplier, you want to know that the server is what they say it is, and you should have a process to assure that. And your suppliers should have processes to, make sure the motherboards come from reliable sources, et cetera, et cetera. So no spot along the way is faulty.
So is it a tinkering question? I mean, is it a matter of getting our enterprise teams just in the guts of the hardware?
Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be them individually in the guts of the hardware, but they have to keep it in mind as they're sourcing stuff. So as they source hardware, they need to know that they're sourcing it from someone who actually is doing the thought process of understanding what's in the hardware.
Sort of like an S-bomb for hardware components.
Yeah, like a bomb.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay, great. Well, can you leave us with any resources that you can recommend, your training maybe where we can find more about that so that people can learn about this area?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm drawing a blank right now.
Well, you can find the Black Hat.
Yeah.
You can find all of his trainings on the Black Hat site.
Yes. So basically, what I find the most interesting thing for someone who's not aware of what's in hardware is every month there's someone else who has posted a blog post of like, hey, I got this IoT device and I tore it apart. And it's often someone who is not hardware experienced. And I think those are the most valuable reviews and valuable sources to see someone who doesn't have a hardware background looking at it and learning all this stuff. So that's what I look for. Every time I see one of those, I'm excited.
Okay, well, we'll keep our eyes out for those exciting blog posts. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. I've learned a lot today, and I know our audience did as well.
Thanks for having me, Becky.
Thank you.